Thank you so much, everyone, for being here for, I don't know what number installment this is now. Fourth, fifth installment, maybe of the semester. Ninth of the year?
In the year, yeah, or 10th.
I'm losing track of time. I'm sorry. Another amazing installment of the series Russia and Its Neighbors in Search of a New Paradigm, hosted by Dr. Yevgenia Algoritmys, which is co-sponsored by both the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies here at NYU and the Jordan Center. My name is Sasha Shpatolnik. I am the program administrator at the Jordan Center. It's my real pleasure to introduce this talk, introduce our speakers today. As many of you may know, Yevgenia Algoritmys is research professor in the NYU Department of Russian and Slavic Studies here at NYU. She's an investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. And since getting her PhD in political science from Harvard University, she's split her time between academia and journalism. Dr. Algoritmys was previously Distinguished Journalist in Residence at the Jordan Center from 2022 to 2023. She has also been a Media and Democracy Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. She teaches political science at the Harvard Extension School and is the author of 4 independently researched books, including The State Within a State, The KGB and Its Hold on Russia, Past, Present, and Future. Today's guest speaker is Екатерина Журавская, professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and a leading scholar in political economy, historical institutionalism, and digital media. Born in Moscow, she received her PhD in economics from Harvard in 1999. She subsequently served as professor at the New Economic School and as academic director of the Center for Economic and Financial Research for a decade in Moscow. Following the deterioration of media and academic freedoms in Russia after Vladimir Putin's war in Georgia, she relocated to the Paris School of Economics. Her research has been widely published in leading peer-reviewed journals, including the American Economic Review, where she's served as co-editor since 2023. She is a foreign honorary member of the American Economic Association. Her recent work examines the effects of internet-based media and digital networks on political behavior. In particular, her latest study analyzes the algorithms of X, owned by Elon Musk, and their impact on political attitudes. This research was published in the February 2026 issue of Nature. Today, the title of today's talk is Social Media Algorithms and Political Attitudes. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Algoritmys.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you very much to Jordan Center and to the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies for allowing me to run this program. And thank you to all of you for coming to this talk. It's really, exceptional event because Екатерина Журавская is one of the leading scholars in the field of, in the study of how political institutions, media, and economic policies shape societies. She wrote quite a few, distinguished papers, widely peer-reviewed and widely commented all across the globe. She was awarded several awards, and she was pronounced the leading woman economist of Europe. I interviewed Екатерина several times, and once for my magazine, the New Times, while I was still in Moscow. And she did amazing research in the field of historical institutionalism on the role of radio and impact of radio control in Hitler's Germany. She reviewed, they managed to figure out to which extent the 1933 elections, which Hitler, of course, won, its party won, to which extent a radio, which was controlled by the state after, and after Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, so the Nazi party got control over the radio. So to which extent it had impact on the outcomes of elections. And apparently her research suggested that this control over radio, and it was the major medium in the then Germany, gave Hitler additional 12%. So she did, quite a few amazing works. And this is, her She wrote several works, several papers on the impact of social networks on social media, on policy choices, on democracy, etc., along with her co-author, Professor Sergei Guriev, who happens to be her husband as well. Right, Sasha? Katya? Yeah. Anyway, and today she's going to talk about her latest paper that devoted to the political effects of X, former Twitter, which owned by Elon Musk, on the feed algorithm on political choices and political attitudes. Katya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zhenya. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to everybody who have come. The first thing I would like to say is that I offer you an apology. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I am not there in person, and I really appreciate the fact that you came nonetheless, even though it's really after COVID, there is quite a lot of fatigue of having online seminars, but let's hope that nonetheless it will be worth it. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is I'm an economist. And in economics, usually when paper is published, we stop talking about it because that means that, okay, it's done deal, we move on. However, this paper was published in Nature, and it's a very, very different business because we were not able to present the results before it was out, and it came out only in February. Because it was under embargo, because that's the rules of publishing in sort of general scientific journals. So that's why it's time for us to tell you about the results. So this is joint work with Germain Gauthier, Roland Odler, and Philin Widmer. And let me just dive right in. Hopefully, look, so first of all, I know that Zhenya thinks that all the questions should be asked at the end, and I respect that. But if there's really very pressing questions, I would be very, very happy to deviate from that rule. So let me start. And I hope that in this audience, I don't really need to convince you that social media has transformed our lives. And it transformed it profoundly in all sorts of different ways. Now we have a large and still growing share of the global population, despite of the AI, that uses social media to connect with others, to get entertained, to learn about the world. And importantly, and that's what's going to be key for this particular study, it actually is used by many people in order to get political news. And given that we're going to talk about the US today, I can give you the US figures. So the quarter of US adult population uses social media to learn everything they actually consume as far as political news. So all political news they consume are through social media platforms. And about half of the US population get political news at least sometimes from social media. That's really a very, very significant medium of learning political news. So that brings us to the very important question, which is, okay, so when we get political news on social media, what kind of news do we see? Who determines what we read and how? And in fact, it is determined by a black box, which is called feed algorithm nowadays, where platforms use those algorithms, which are machine learning complicated systems, in order to personalize content, which pretty much any platform would do in order to increase engagement. There might be other reasons for changing feed in the feed algorithms, but any social media platform would want to increase engagement because this is basic business model of social media. The more eyes people have on the platform, the better is their revenue from advertising. So before the algorithms were introduced, essentially in the social media feed, what you would see is the reverse chronological order of the posts made by the accounts which people follow. In Facebook, that would be friends. In Twitter, it would be just your followings. And with the introduction of the algorithm, it all essentially changed. Now it's a machine which determines what you see. And the reason for this is the following, that algorithms are able to first give you and put in your feed posts from the accounts which you do not follow at all, and also reorder all the posts. And they can reorder to the extent that you do not see at all the posts by the accounts you follow. So in other words, algorithms fully control your feed. Well, with that, there has been a lot of concerns which have been raised by academics, public intellectuals, journalists, interested individuals who all say, well, if the machine determines the political news that people consume, that could be really, really dangerous. And in particular, it could be dangerous for forming social cohesion, trust, and even ultimately for democracy. And why would these concerns be reasonable? Well, because even if we consider social media, which only maximizes engagement, that may lead to increase of spreading misinformation, toxic content, and also increasing polarized information environment. Why? Because actually humans are hardwired to react to toxic content. For example, they when they see something which is inflammatory, they get engaged. That's why even increasing engagement may lead to increase in toxic content. Why misinformation? Well, because if we think about making a political news more engaging, and if we compare one piece of news with no constraints and the other piece of news with constraint on being true, you can spin the one which has no constraints to be more engaging again. And finally, because of cognitive dissonance, because of the fact that we as humans actually are hardwired to react more positively and more strongly to the information which actually we are positively predisposed to, these algorithms which maximize engagement may actually create so-called filter bubbles, leading you those pieces of political news which align with your priors, but increasingly polarized. So that all is really, really serious concerns, and they're very well founded in theory. The question then is, well, what about evidence? How are these algorithms work in reality? So, and here, before our study, there's actually two things to say about the evidence. The first one is, if you just look at generally the effects of internet and social media, the rollout of them, the change in political equilibrium, which is associated with this new technical phenomenon, the ICT revolution, we have a lot of studies, including, I also contributed to that, which show that there are important political effects, or which span through information, attitudes, elections, protests, what have you, a lot of things. Yet, if we think about what did we know about the effect of the feed algorithms on social media, which I just discussed, we have just one study, which is a very important study, which got out in Science in 2023. That's Guess et al. That study is a part of the large experiment, or series of experiments, I should say, which was conducted during the 2020 election campaign in the US. It's called Meta 2020 Election Study, where essentially Facebook cooperated with the researchers in order to try to set several experiments. And one of the experiments, which is particularly relevant for what I'm saying today, is the big experiment which took Instagram and Facebook and switched off the algorithmic feed, namely replaced it by the chronological feed of the accounts people follow on Instagram and Facebook during the election campaign. And what happened? Well, this kind of turning off the algorithm changed the content that users saw. as one would expect. It lowered substantially the engagement, again, as one would expect. But at the same time, it had absolutely no effect on political attitudes. Well, it's a very large study. It's internally super consistent, and it's done absolutely fantastically. So the authors actually, and I need to give a lot of credit to the authors, they actually presented this as an effect of turning the algorithm off. At the same time, that study was received by sort of a broader audience and in some ways misinterpreted. And I'm going to talk about that a lot today in the following way, that a lot of people kind of got these results and interpret them in the following way, that, okay, we thought that Facebook was responsible for electing Donald Trump in 2016, but given that we see that algorithm doesn't matter, well, maybe we were wrong. However, and that's where we come in with our study, it is important to note that even if you very, very cleanly identify what happens if you turn off the algorithm, that does not mean that it tells you a lot about the overall effect of the algorithm, particularly if that algorithm somehow has a persistent effect. If there is something which it changes in attitudes of individuals in the longer run, which lives longer than the exposure to the algorithmic feed itself. Well, that's a hypothesis and we need to test it. And it's impossible to test it on Meta for the very simple reason that in Meta products, everybody by default have algorithmic feed unless Mark Zuckerberg turns it off, which actually happened in this Meta study in 2020. So the question is, what do you do? Well, we can turn to other social media. It's also important to note that, the world doesn't end with Meta. There are other important social media which we may want to look into. And that's what we do in this study. So we are looking at the effects of feed algorithm on X. And we're going to look at the online behavior and political opinions as outcomes. And before I get to to tell you what the results of the study are, let me give you just a couple of background points on the background information. Of course, most of you know, but it's still worth repeating that Elon Musk completed the acquisition of Twitter in October 2022. And he rebranded it X in July 2023. That's pretty much at the time when our study is set. It's worth noting that about a little bit below a third of US adult population uses it. And unlike with Facebook, the primary use of most users is actually reading about politics. And on top of that, of course, and that's something which, I don't need to mention in this audience, the owner of this social media platform openly expresses his political views. So what we do, we conduct an RCT, randomized control trial on X in the summer of 2023. So 8 months into the ownership by Elon Musk of the social media. Importantly, and we can discuss it later, why we think that it's very important, we conducted that independently of the platform. Or maybe even now I can jump in and say why that would be important. Well, because when the researchers need to cooperate with social media platforms, we need to realize that when they agree to cooperate or when they invite the researchers in and say, okay, let's study our social media platform, that probably very often means that they already know the answer because they actually are experimenting all the time. We just, unfortunately, neither public nor researchers know the results of these studies. So why we were able to do it independently? Well, because we were able to use then unique feature of X. Now there are several social media platforms like Blue Sky who also have that. that feature where users can actually choose the type of feed they have. They can control it themselves. In particular, on X, there are two tabs, one called For You and the other called Following. So if you are on For You tab, that means that this is an algorithmic feed. If you are on the Following, at the time when we conducted this study, that was the chronological feed. It's not anymore, and it's very important to know. If you're a user of X, maybe you need to see that there is a little check on the right of the tab Following, and then when you click it, you need to go deeper into the setting in order to choose most recent, and only then you're going to get the chronological feed. And that started in January 2026, so after our study already. Importantly also, at the time of our study, if a person was on one of these tabs and then signed off to Twitter or X, and then signs on in another device, once you sign in, you get to the same Twitter setting. So that was very, very handy for doing what we did. So we have assigned randomly about 5,000 users to either be on this For You tab, on the Following tab, and we paid them to stay on the assigned feed for 7 weeks. And then we surveyed them. Essentially, the way we built our sample is through the online platform YouGov. And then at the end line survey, we asked them about their user experience, about how much they use X, about their general political attitudes. Importantly, we also asked about the, excuse me, current news-related political opinions. And that's what we pre-registered, but we couldn't pre-register what would be the topics. And it turned out that during these 7 weeks, the most important topics were the criminal investigations against Donald Trump, which now people mostly forgotten about, and what unfortunately is still very much in the agenda, the war in Ukraine. So on top of, so that was, these are survey outcomes. But on top of that, in order to understand what's happening, we were able, for the subset of users, to collect their actual feeds and their counterfactual feeds. So we built a special Google Chrome extension, and we asked our users to download it, to run it on the desktops, and then for those who had desktops, not everybody had desktops. Some of our users used X on their phones, but for those, we were able to collect 100 top posts on both chronological and on the algorithmic feed for these people. And on top of that, we also kindly asked them to share their X handles with us, which we used in order to collect information on accounts they follow. So that's basically the setting. Now, let me, before I really show you the results, give you the feel of what we find. So first of all, what we find is that, okay, maybe I step back and say that this setting allows us to do two things. It allows us to essentially do an experiment which is very similar to a meta-study for those people who initially were on the algorithmic feed. We could test what happens when they switch to the chronological feed. And at the same time, for those people who initially were on the Following tab, on the chronological feed, we can study what happens if the algorithmic feed is turned on. So the first thing we see is that once the algorithmic feed is turned off, in other words, once you replace algorithmic feed with the chronological feed, we see no political effects whatsoever. So exactly the same result as with meta-study. But that's where their story ends and where our story essentially begins. The reason for this is that we also see that for those people who initially were on the chronological feed, if you turn the algorithmic feed on, and then what happens is that we see significant shifts of political opinions towards sort of more conservative, more Trumpist, more Republican. And I will tell you exactly what I mean by that in a second. But this is sort of the basic idea. So now there are two things to see here. The first one is that even though sort of meta-analysis in 2020 and X-analysis in 2023, these are very, very different experiments in some ways. So it's different social media, different time periods, different audience, a lot of things are different. And yet we find this a very, very similar result, that turning off the algorithm doesn't affect political attitudes. That actually gives external validity to both studies and maybe helps us to think that we can generalize across those studies. So now the next question, which is important, is, okay, why do you have this asymmetry between turning on and turning off the algorithm? And here, in order to do this, we need to see two things. First, what algorithm promotes. And here, and I'll show you the results very in a few minutes, but let me just say it briefly, that algorithms does push more conservative content, particularly generated by political activists, and hides traditional media. But of course, that does not explain the asymmetry of the effects of the turning on and off of the algorithm. So the question is, what does? And here, our information on who follows whom helps enormously, because what we see is that for those people who initially were on the chronological feed, once they get exposed to the algorithmic feed, to this new engaging and sometimes inflammatory and exciting content generated by conservative political activists, they start clicking follow. Their network of followings changes. But that means that once the algorithm is turned off, you still get the content which is generated by these accounts because you still follow them. And that essentially is a very simple mechanism which can explain how you could have persistent effects of the algorithms which live longer than the actual exposure to the algorithmic feed. So let me be brief and skip all points on the slide with the exception of the last one, which is that, of course, X is a very, very special social media owned by Elon Musk now. However, there's one study which appeared in PNAS in 2022, which it didn't study the effect on the users, but it studied the content of Twitter, how it changed in 2016 when Twitter first introduced the algorithm. And it's important to note that at the time, Twitter was very liberal in terms of both content creators and the user base. And yet, even then, introducing algorithm moved the content somewhat to the right. And that gives another important sort of general validity point for what I'm talking to you about today. So now let me sort of go and give you a little go into detail and give you a little bit of the meat for this study. So the sample is about 5,000 people. Importantly, this is the sample at the end line. However, we recruited them first. We, randomized them into these treatments, and then, after 7 weeks, we surveyed them again. So 5,000 people, that's whom we managed to get at the end. However, in order to get there, we needed to actually reach out to more people. So the overall attrition was about 28%. And that's important because one needs to be worried whether this kind of attrition may drive the results. So I can tell you right away that this is not the case. I'm not going to have time to explain to you the technicalities of it, but there are ways with Lee bounds to show that the results are completely robust when you control for potential selective attrition. The other important point, and I'm going to actually dive into that right away afterwards, is that initially a quarter of the participants were on a chronological feed and 3/4 on the algorithmic feed. And that was their choice. Only after they arrived to us, we could randomize their feed into the experimental treatment. Of course, people who self-select into chronological and algorithmic feed are different kinds of people. So then it is very important to note that is it possible that the asymmetry in switching on and off the algorithm actually is driven by the differences in these characteristics. So a very important part of the paper is really devoted to showing that this selection into the initial feed is not what's driving this asymmetry. And finally, another very important technical point, sorry to bore you with the technicalities, but they are very important for the validity of what I'm saying, is that unlike with the meta study where Mark Zuckerberg ensured compliance because he held the lever and turned off the algorithm for the random sample of participants. We actually were not cooperating with the platform, so we needed to rely on the respondents to actually stay on the feed which we experimentally assigned to them. Only for a subset of people who did run the Google phone extension, we observe their feed directly. And that's where we can see that compliance was very high. But for the rest, we can't ensure it with one caveat that at the very end, when we already paid them, we asked them very kindly, could you please tell us whether you complied or not? None of your payments will depend on that. If you truthfully tell us, you will just help us as researchers. So we try to rely on experimental demand effects to elicit this information to the extent that they told the truth. The compliance was very high, but there we cannot really be sure. Importantly, if compliance was less high than they report, we would expect attenuation in the effects, and the true effects of the turning on the algorithms, we would expect it to be even higher. Okay, let me skip this other details on the data and come directly to some of the results. So first, let me just give you a feel with the raw data of what we observe. So there are two rows here. Sorry if it's a big row. I hope that you can see what I'm showing you, and the screen is not too small. But if not, I will just walk you through what you want to see. So on top, this is the summary of raw data for some outcomes. These are just examples. I'm going to show you the overall effects in a second, but these are important outcomes, I would say, where for users who are initially on the chronological feed, we show what these levels of these outcomes on average are at the end line survey. So after 7 weeks exposure to the experimental treatment for algorithmic and chronological feed separately. So in other words, this is the effect of turning on the algorithm for 7 weeks. And what we see is that X is being used more, so there's more engagement. Then we also see that after 7 weeks exposure to the algorithm, people, when they are asked about what kind of policy priorities they have, they are 5 percentage points more likely to say we share the priorities of policies which generally are the ones which are picked by Republicans. What are these? These are immigration, crime, and inflation, as opposed to the democratic policy priorities, which are the healthcare, education, and climate. So that we already see significant shift in priorities of people. But then also on the views of the current affairs, we also see pretty large shifts. For example, we asked a series of questions about what do you think about the current criminal investigations against Donald Trump, and on average, people who get exposed for the algorithm for 7 weeks are 5.5 percentage points more likely to say that they're not unacceptable for several reasons. They think that this is an attack on the democracy because he will potentially be candidate. He didn't declare at the time yet his candidacy, but still. So that's the attack on the rule of law, the attack on people like us, and so on and so forth. So it's, again, a pretty sizable effect of 5.5 percentage points. And then we also ask a series of questions on the war of Ukraine. I'll show you the aggregates in a second, but sort of if we look at the one outcome, which is the anti-Zelensky sentiment, it also is very, very strongly affected by the exposure to the algorithmic feed, 7.4 percentage points. All of this is on the top row. Now, on the bottom row, it's exactly the same outcomes, and they're exactly the same way, raw data summarized after 7 weeks of turning the algorithm off. And what you can see is that absolutely nothing going on. And interestingly so, also, for example, on the policy priorities, the 7-week exposure to the algorithm brings you to the long-term equilibrium in terms of the level of the Republican policy priorities. Okay, so that's basically the feel of the results using just raw data. Of course, we cannot write a study where we ask many questions and then we pick those where the results we like. So in order to really have a validity of the study, we need to aggregate it up, basically look at all the questions which we ask and see whether the effects survive for all questions. Otherwise, we have a problem with multiple hypothesis testing, essentially. So here, on this graph, we basically try to summarize what's happening. So first, on the right, these are the overall effects of turning the algorithm off. And without getting much on the details, I can tell you that the only thing where we see something is engagement going down and nothing else. And that's very much consistent with the meta study. At the same time, here are the effects of turning the algorithm on, and we see that all different metrics of user engagement increase a lot. We see that policy priorities and current affairs, including pro-Kremlin attitudes towards the war, and there are many different questions there, they all move towards more pro-Republican. If we aggregate all attitudes and all current news, again, there is a significant and large effect. All of these are standardized here. But, and that's very interesting and important, and I want to highlight it here, if we ask the questions about self-reported partisanship, none of them are affected. So in this very partisan and polarized environment of the United States in the summer 2023, somebody who proclaims to be Republican doesn't switch to be Democrat and vice versa. So that we don't see. And we also don't see any effect on affective polarization. If you look at the attitudes towards your own party minus attitudes of the opposing party, there is no effect on that either. So the next important point here to make is that, okay, let me maybe, given that time flies very fast, I'll skip some technical details, but let me just say several things. The first one is okay, how are these samples of people who are initially on chronological feed and initially on the algorithmic feed differ? And we have a lot of observables about them. And I have to say that when we look at all of them, the only thing which matters is that people who are initially on the chronological feed, they are more likely to be female, college-educated, white, older, frequent X users, and users of X, not for entertainment, but rather than for politics. Of course, these people may have very different effects when they're exposed to different information. So we should worry about these characteristics that they actually affect or determine the fact that turning on and turning off the algorithm has asymmetric effects. So what we can do here, one thing which we can do, and that's what I present on the slide, we can reweight the samples so that, we can estimate the effects of turning the algorithm on for people who look like those who are initially on the algorithmic feed and vice versa. And we see that there is no difference whatsoever. On top of that, we can examine what are the heterogeneities in treatment with respect to all these observable characteristics which predict whether people initially are on chronological feed or not. And again, we find that it's very, very robust. So in other words, these effects, this heterogeneity in turning on and turning off the algorithm is not driven by selection of people, different kinds of people into initial feed. The other thing to note is that all of these results actually are driven by Republicans and independents. If we split the sample into Democrats and Republicans and independents, we see that it's only Republicans who are becoming sort of more focused on Republican policy priorities. Those are the ones who start thinking that maybe investigating Donald Trump is not acceptable. Actually, in our sample, all Democrats think that, yes, you should investigate whoever, including Donald Trump, and there's no variation, in that whatsoever. So now, let me just try to move on a little bit, because I know that time flies, and show you what the algorithm promotes. So the first thing we see is that it promotes more engaging content, but this is something which everybody would expect. So this is really reality check. There's nothing interesting in this. So the second thing is, if we look at our measures of how political the content is, we see two very important lessons. First, that the algorithm promotes more political content, which actually is not a priori obvious, because in principle you could think that you could promote more entertainment, more kittens, or more skiing, whatever is important for entertainment for different people. But it turns out that political content is promoted more, and among political content there is more conservative content, more pro-Republican content. Importantly, liberal content is also more promoted, not only conservative, but the share of conservative content among all political content becomes bigger under the algorithm. On top of that, what we see is that algorithm very aggressively promotes political activists. How do we define political activists? These are people these are just regular users, not media, not government organizations, not NGOs, but these are people who tweet a lot about politics. And we see that the algorithm, interestingly, promotes both conservative and liberal activists. And it's going to be important for the story. And I know that I need to wrap up very, very soon. But given that the introductions were about 7 minutes, I hope Zhenya will allow me to take that time to finish up that story. All right, so now what I would like to show you, and sorry that may be a little bit small, the same picture, but once you split between Democrats and Republican and independents. And we pull Republican and independents together because for all practical purposes, they look very, very similar, actually. So So what we see, the first thing we see, and that's what we would expect, that people have a lot more co-partisan content in their feeds. So Democrats see a lot more liberal content and Republicans see a lot more conservative content. However, and that's very, very interesting, for both Democrats and Republicans, conservative content is more aggressively promoted. So that's important. That's not something where we have where we see the asymmetry. At the same time, it's also important that liberal activists are promoted both for Republicans and for Democrats. And the final thing, which is very important as far as policy implications of the study is concerned, as far as I would say, is that we see that algorithm demotes traditional media very aggressively. And it demotes both liberal and conservative traditional media. So Fox News is also not shown, essentially. So, right, that's the main results as far as what algorithm promotes on X. But that, of course, does not explain the asymmetry of why you would have results when you turn the algorithm on and not when you turn the algorithm off. And in order to unpack that, we studied what the users follow and how the exposure to this algorithmic feed changes the user followers. And let me just zoom in into this slide because it summarizes basically everything. So again, when you turn the algorithm off, you basically see nothing. But when you turn the algorithm on, what happens is that people start following a lot more conservative accounts or accounts which generate conservative content. They start following more political activists accounts and only driven by conservative political activist accounts. So remember, I showed you that algorithm promotes liberal activists as well. Unfortunately, these liberal activists are not engaging enough for the users, so they're not being clicked on to follow. Only conservative accounts being followed because of the exposure to this new content. And that essentially explains this asymmetry, because once you turn on the algorithm, you get more conservative feed. But once you turn it off, you retain it, especially in the dimensions which are important to you because you clicked on follow, follow, follow. And that's what explains the effect. In order to understand whether this is true or not, we also need the last point, which is that we need to verify that indeed, after being exposed to the algorithm, that changes your chronological feed. And that's what we show. We show that after 7-week exposure to the algorithmic feed, the chronological feed of people, which we also observed due to our Google Chrome extension capabilities, it has 7 percentage points significantly more posts by conservative accounts and 5 percentage points more posts by conservative political activists. And we also are able to see that there's nothing mechanical in what's happening with your chronological feed if you just turn on the algorithmic feed and turn it off. How we can do that? We can do exactly the same analysis, but at our baseline survey, where we asked our respondents to just switch into the experimental feed, but they didn't have any time to get exposed to that feed. And in that particular time, this switch does not affect the chronological feed. So what that means is that the effects are real and they come from the behavior of the users. So with that, let me come to the conclusion here. And basically, I won't repeat what I've just told you. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&As. However, I would like to just draw several broad lessons. The first one is, of course, one needs to look at the change in both directions in order to understand the effect of the algorithm. That's one very important point. The second very important point to us is that we need to examine a broader set of outcomes beyond just partisanship and affective polarization. And many studies in political science and in economics, political economy, focus on partisanship and affective polarization. And at the same time, the attitudes, the opinions are very important, and they actually could be decisive for many things, even though people do not change labels of their party that easily. So if they start expressing different attitudes towards foreign and domestic policy, that's already very important. And finally, there is a very, very sort of well-cited study, Bakshi et al., which studied the introduction of the algorithm in Facebook, and that was much earlier than for Twitter, which looked at what kind of content people consume after the algorithm has been introduced. And they come to the conclusion that even under algorithm, people see a lot of content which is generated by accounts they follow. And in that study, they conclude, well, maybe algorithms don't matter very much. However, what we show in our study is that algorithm determines which accounts you follow, which means that it matters a lot more than it was thought before. And let me stop here, and I hope that we can have a discussion now. Sorry if I took a little bit longer. Now, I think it's if we take the time of the introductions out, I'm still on time, I hope. Thank you.
Yes. Katya, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I am extremely, I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of data that you presented and all the statistical work that you did. I understand that for you, it's just, it's your piece of cake, that's what you do. But for political scientists, it's not, what we really do on a regular basis. Anyway, this is amazing. Now, first we'll start with the questions from the audience with respect to the presentation. Only with respect to presentation. If you need to clarify something, please raise your hand and ask a question. Then we will follow up with other questions. So, yeah. Anyone? Yes, please, Pasha. Pavel Igor.
Yes, Екатерина. Good evening. I'm just expected students to ask questions first, and not everyone. But the question is basically why? Why algorithms push towards conservative views?
Excellent question. And I don't have a straight answer. It's an ongoing research agenda. It's hard to say any facts about that before we actually pin them down. However, I still would like to suggest several hypotheses, let's say, which are interrelated. So essentially, it is not impossible that some of what we observe here is just the X specific, that indeed, part of what the algorithm is doing is just showing everybody Elon Musk himself. And he's certainly, conservative political activist by our standards. So that's not impossible. However, as I showed you before, even in liberal social media, sometimes we observe this conservative shift. So, and we also see in the data that if we just compare sort of the bulk of conservative generated content with the bulk of liberal generated content, we see that there is more engagement with conservative content. However, of course, this more engagement doesn't really tell you that there is a causal effect of engagement on promoting conservative political content. Why? Because the engagement metrics, it's already a result of algorithm promoting it. So having said all of this, we do see that people react more to promoted conservative content compared to promoted liberal content, which means that your question of why would that be the case is still warranted. And here, I think we still need to come to social psychology and think about what humans are hardwired to react to and to be engaged with. So, of course, all of us are a product of sort of nature and nurture, right? And if we think about sort of the nature, the human evolution ended at a time when the most, let's say, dangerous thing for people, for humans, was other humans from different clans. And maybe that's what actually got enshrined in us as humans. At the same time, given that nature is not the only thing which determines us, a lot of people, like Democrats in this study, which I just showed you, which are not affected by the algorithm, for them the nurture, the culture, the other thing which determines our sort of behavior and attitudes dominates. At the same time, it may very well be the case that this is just what all humans are hardwired for, to be sort of more, particularly those who use social media. Let's put it this way. Let me not generalize too much over it, but if sort of when you formulate the question of why would that be the case, it's the right question, and I think even for that we need to have more evidence. So we can only, both meta study and our study, can only be sure of where we can identify things, and that's kind of beyond what we can do here. So we can only have an open discussion about that. And of course, there is let me just cite other people's work which is related to that as well. So there's a very nice paper by Manacorda, Tabellini, and Tessay, who show that but it's in the context of European elections, that the parties which gain from mobile broadband and social media are those which are particularly promoting communitarian agenda, which is sort of not tolerant to minorities, to outsiders, to migration. And their story is that, well, maybe the whole communication on social media is also sort of conducive to people self-selecting into homogeneous sort of echo chambers, where particularly the echo chamber, which is pro-right wing, is winning on average. So look, it's an excellent question, and I wish I had already a very well identified study which could pin it down perfectly, which I don't yet, but it's ongoing research agenda. We've been discussing how we can identify it well with our co-authors of the same paper. And this is, hopefully I'll come back next year and we'll be able to report back. Sorry for not being more precise on this.
I have a question in development of the previous question. Social media companies make money selling advertising. The more time you spend on the platform, the more ads you see. The more ads you see, the more money they make, right?
Yes.
The algorithm's job is to keep you on the platform as long as possible, right? Is it to say that conservative views attract more ads, at least on X?
The answer is absolutely yes. That thing I can assure that if you look at the engagement with conservative content, that is definitely true. That it's bigger and it brings more money at this point.
Why?
Well, that's exactly the same question as was asked before. So again.
More questions, please?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I was wondering if there's any type of peer effects, like these users are following more conservative content. Are they sharing this content with their family members or friends or not?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it very well. Is it possible to bring the microphone?
Yeah. No, it's okay.
So I was asking if there's any type of peer effects. If these people who are engaging with more conservative content, are they also sharing this with their family members or friends?
Brilliant question, and I cannot tell you that in the context of this study, but in the other context, and including with my own research, but different studies, we see a lot of peer effects. So the peer effects, which actually are very often not linear and very interesting. In particular, what we see very often is that people who are outraged with particular content which they receive, be that on social media or in some other political campaigns, they actually engage a lot more in peer interactions. And those people who get content which they agree with generally, they say, okay, what else is new? It's not interesting. They don't engage very much. So peer effects sometimes actually work in a very interesting way where you would get backfiring from a particular campaign, even though it works on average. So do you see what I'm saying? Is that, it could be that on average people agree with it, but only very small minority may just think, okay, that's nonsense, that's not right. And these people are gonna go and be really, really active talking to their peers about that. And generally, there are definitely important peer effects, and one needs to take them into account. And very often what we see is that when we study this and when we calculate so-called persuasion rate, which is like what is the percentage of people who are persuaded by particular communication out of those which could potentially be persuaded, we get very, very large effects. And then we ask ourselves, why would that be the case? And the only reasonable way to explain it is precisely the peer effects. So that's a very, very good question.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, please.
One more question. So I was wondering.
Yes, speak up.
Okay.
Or microphone, please.
No, I can, or keep it going. Yeah.
Thank you. So one difference between Meta and Twitter, especially Instagram and Twitter, which is, I think, very important in the results, is that in Twitter you can retweet other people's content, where in Instagram you're mostly publishing your own content. So I think controlling this would increase the treatment effect that you were studying, but since you can monitor the content that people are seeing for some accounts, were you looking if they are seeing original content or they were seeing like quotes or retweets?
Yeah. Look, so let me first say that we do have information whether these are retweets or original content, and I don't remember what we got. I don't think we got anything very interesting about that. That's why it didn't get into the paper at the end. But let me just push back a little bit on your first point, which is that, well, of course, you're right that you can easily retweet on X, but you can also reshare content on Facebook. So I don't think that conceptually there's such a big difference between the two. That said, I must say that I certainly am absolutely in agreement with you that these are very different social media. And there are many ways in which they're different. But I would say that this particular one is actually working pretty well. So if I get a content which was fed to me on the by the algorithm on Meta product, then I can repost it. Actually, I'm not very well on Instagram. I can tell you that on Facebook that's the case. On Instagram, I don't know. Maybe you're right on Instagram. Yeah, and then it everybody who would be on a chronological feed would see, or who see my post would see that repost. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look. Yeah. We can look at more into that, but there isn't really much which was going on with that.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Professor Jurowska. Thank you. I want to go back to the why question. In one of your slides, I think you mentioned that if you, at the beginning of the study, if you say that you're a Democrat, like you don't change. Being exposed to algorithm, and if you say that you're a Republican, you will stay a Republican. And you also say that the pro-Republican or conservative content is pushed. So I actually thought that the aim is to like convert people into more conservative views, but you show that it's not the case. So maybe it's about those people who are kind of doubt, like something in between, like the independence. The independence. So if you could, again, it's a hypothesis, like, right? So you don't show it in the study. The why question is still is kind of in the air. And the second question, any plans to conduct research on TikTok? Because in TikTok, and by the way, we started TikTok with Evgenia Markovna, so you should all subscribe to it, about stocks. And I can see that, like, personally, like I posted a very nice and engaging video, almost nothing, right? Then the next video was an AI generated video, and more likes, more engagement. So the more you post, that's what I feel, the more likely you will get likes, followings, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as far as the differences between Democrats and Republicans, the first thing is that I'm not at all surprised that this kind of effects, and given what algorithm promotes, that does not affect Democrats. And the reason for this is that all of the persuasion literature has been showing us that it's impossible, almost impossible, to convince people to completely radically change their minds. So it's like it would have been completely unbelievable if it were the case. So whenever persuasion works, it works on those who are either, as you say, completely sort of with flat prior or slightly positively predisposed. So what persuasion does, it kind of moves you towards the direction into which you were already looking. So that doesn't mean that there is no effect overall, because on average that there is an effect. And on average, also what you have is you observe polarization, even though we don't have Democrats moving into either direction. The fact that Republicans move away from Democrats in terms of sort of their views and attitudes, that still results in polarization. So that's essentially what we can see here. And you are absolutely right that, you know, probably among the Republicans, those who hold particularly extreme views were also not affected, because there's only a margin of how persuasion could work. You need to be able to be moved, right? If you already hold the most extreme attitudes, you wouldn't be moved in that direction. So that's as much as I can say here. So I see that you wanted to follow up. Yes.
Yeah, but would you say, again, it's the hypothesis that they could work with independents who, because you only showed us Democrats and Republicans, but or I don't know, or people who say like, I'm neutral, right?
Yeah,
and
so
that this algorithm could work for them. So convert those people who doubt, basically, who are not sure. Like, this is the way to like move them to conservative values or whatever.
Absolutely right. And that's what we show. We have the results for independence separately. The reason why I haven't shown them to you is because we you know, the results become a little bit noisier because the sample, of course, shrinks. But for all practical purposes, independents behave the same way as Republicans. And indeed, you are right that the margin of how much they can be moved is bigger. And that's also completely in line with sort of the theory of persuasion, how persuasion works. So now you asked also about TikTok, and here I should say that I am very, very happy that one of my grad students has a really, really fantastic work now on TikTok. So I think so he will be probably on the market next year. So you will hear more about that. But I think I still will need to postpone that. So we certainly think about TikTok, and if you look at sort of just all of the research in social sciences on different social media platforms, it's really skewed because the researchers are kind of not moving fast enough with the technology. We're still researching Facebook and TikTok, and Twitter, whereas particularly young people move to TikTok mostly. And yeah, well, it's coming. It's in the making, and it's very important to look at it for sure. Importantly, also, I should say that, in many ways, thinking of TikTok as social media is a weird way to look at it, because it's a sort of a short video platform where there is really no social interactions whatsoever. So it's really interaction of individuals with algorithms rather than a social phenomenon.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask, talking about TikTok and the other platforms that you analyze, how much do the information that the platforms allow you as a researcher to access change the way change the way that you design the study? Because I'm thinking about TikTok, which is specifically hard to research because it's audiovisual and you need to go through their process, which can limit sometimes the kind of information that you can access. Whether this is usually easier on text-based platforms that are public-facing, like Twitter. So is that a concern that you had designing the study? And if you can talk a little bit more about how can one approach TikTok if there's something that you are familiar with. Thank you.
This is an excellent question, and I must say that it's a huge worry and a big constraint, and indeed it's very, very hard to do this. So far, what people who've done credible research on this with sources of variation which are exogenous have done, they looked at the at the quasi-exogenous shifters of the amount of penetration rather than anything else. So without actually seeing what each individual person is looking at. So unlike with what we've done with the Google Chrome extension, I'm not aware of the possibilities to really collect all the information about what people see, with one caveat that you could, in principle, build an app which would capture all of the interactions of people with the devices, and some people are able to collect panels of individuals who really give the whole information like that. But it's very, very rare. Like, the best we can do most of the time is to use ComScore data, which basically tells you what kind of apps and sort of internet addresses you go to, but it of course doesn't tell you within the app what you see. So generally it's a problem, but there are two ways to approach it. One is to try to go through the European regulation. So there is the several sets of laws which within the Digital Services Act, which the European Parliament has passed, which actually obliges platforms to give access to researchers to do a lot more than what you could do in the US. But it's actually still very problematic because they are trying to sabotage it as much as possible. So that would be one possibility. The other possibility is completely different one, not to try to cooperate with either governments or with platforms, but cooperate with users, just pay users so that they report to you what they watch and see, or even just record their screens. But that's expensive, and it's going to be a selective group of people because not everybody is ready to show you what they see on their feed.
Thank you. Katia, I have a question. In the 2020 collection of papers, the volume Social Media and Democracy, the State of the Field, Prospects for Reform, edited by Nathan Persley and Joshua Tata, two opposing views are discussed. One, that technology is important for democracy. Another one, that technology is not important for democracy. What view do you share?
It's a very, very it's a question which is worth several books. Let's say, it's not going to be a short answer. But I'll try to summarize my view on this. So it basically first of all, I very much believe that social media has changed the way the democracy operates and has changed the political equilibrium. And it has changed political equilibrium both in democracies and in the autocracies. And there, I would definitely will be, among these two camps, I would be in the one which would say, no, it's important. But then we're going to need to dive in and try to understand how is it important. But before we get to this, let me just say why. So what would be the arguments for people who say, no, it's not important? Most of the time, they basically base these conclusions on the null effects of some of the RCTs, but these RCTs are by design partial equilibrium. So in other words, if you if you just change something, very very small thing in some users, that's not gonna change how our society operates. So these kind of small RCTs are not designed to be able to answer the question, what is the macro effect of this? At the same time, there are other ways we can look at it. For example, we can look at how mobile broadband internet spread. That's something where we could look at the equilibrium level, general equilibrium level effects. So the whole subnational region or the whole country suddenly gets access to mobile broadband and social media with it. Does that change anything? And there we see the very, very important, profound effects. And so so how much time do I have to summarize what I see on this? Give me, how many minutes would you tell me? Would you give me?
3.
Huh?
2-3 minutes?
2-3 minutes. Okay, excellent. So the first thing which we see, and that's where I can, given that it's 3 minutes, I'll just only talk about my own research. Otherwise, we can talk about sort of more stuff. But anyway, so what we see is the following. There is this, if you look at the European political landscape from before the Second World War to today, I could say that, well, maybe I can even show you one picture, because I think I know where it is. If I will be able to share it, it's going to be easier to see. Hold on. Yeah, if I will be able to do this quickly, and I think I will, it will be easier to see this. Just 1 second. Share there. Okay, I think you see this now. So what this is just a figure from The Economist a few months back. And what you see is that until 2010, until about here, Europe generally was dominated in terms of political landscape by center left and center right parties. And of course, there were some deviations, especially when Berlin Wall fell and stuff. But up until here, it was just both of this together would be like about 80 percentage points of the whole of the support of the electorate. But then something fundamentally started changing. And guess what? That coincides exactly with the spread, with the coming of mobile broadband and social media. It's like when five-star movement started to appear with Beppe Grillo and stuff like this. So and we see that the center right and center left started losing. We see that both extreme right and extreme left started winning. But then actually it's just extreme right which was continued winning. And what we see is that by today, it used to be two dominant parties, now it's three, with extreme right as a third important source. So the question is, can this be related to social media? And the answer is absolutely yes. So we have studied how mobile broadband and others after us as well, how it changed political equilibrium in Europe. And we see that we can attribute that pattern to that. So that's one point. Second point is that we also looked globally at the data, and that's a paper which we published 5 years ago in QJE. We looked at how mobile broadband in democracies and in autocracies affected confidence in government and attitudes towards incumbents generally. And the answer is that in all places essentially alike, once social media and mobile broadband comes in, incumbents lose. And the confidence in the national government is reduced. So then there are two questions. One is, and what happens in two-party systems? Like in the US, you cannot have new parties emerging, right? So what we show, and that's my ongoing research, but we already are absolutely sure of the result, we show that it actually translated into something else. Of course, new parties cannot emerge, but the parties could change, new candidates within parties could emerge, and incumbency advantage could decline. And that's something which was like very well documented political phenomenon in the US, particularly for congressional elections. And we see that it is shrinking tremendously. So that's as far as the democracies are concerned. So we have very, very good evidence that, of course, social media is important. That's coming back to your question. Now, as far as dictatorships is concerned, again, we can talk for a long time, but given that you gave me 3 minutes, let me just tell you that even though there is research on this, but I can answer that with one example. So Vladimir Putin had a lot of resources at his disposal, the troll farms, the enormous amount of money, and yet he could do nothing to do anything against the word of Alexei Navalny, who was just posting the investigations of corruption on YouTube. So he had to poison him and eventually kill him because there was no other way to shut this from social media. And the reason for this is that people are actually seeking for information, which expose corruption of the elites, including in dictatorship. And that's why what we see is that, the trend in dictatorships is now, or in autocratic regimes, is now more and more into controlling the internet and censoring the social media. Well, Chinese, of course, have figured it out a long time ago, but a lot more countries nowadays have controls of the internet.
I will ask Sasha to show the map that I prepared that precisely in view what of your the second part of your answer, because In the several papers, including those you co-authored with Professor Sergei Guri, you insist that social networks have a rather negative effect on democratic process as they enhance political polarization, radicalism, ruin associations, which are essential for building the social capital. However, as you just mentioned, dictators, whether in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, in China, Iran, and now in Russia, in fact, do show that they're concerned about the impact of social networks. And that's why Meta platforms, as well as X, are officially designated as extremist and terrorist organizations in Russia as of 2022, making it illegal to operate in Russia. Facebook, Instagram, X are banned in Russia, and using them requires a VPN, as the same is true for Iran and China, while advertising on these platforms is bad. So why such a different impact of social media in democracies and in dictatorships? And you can see here that, Russia is now, one of the most restrictive countries in terms of internet, also China the same, and the former Soviet Union republics, the Asian republics in the Central Asia are the same, whereas much of the other world, especially in Europe and in the Americas, there is free internet more or less.
Yeah. Look, so it's an excellent question, and I would say that one should it is true that in some places the internet threatens democracy, in others it kind of promotes it, and this is why there is this debate between those people who think that this is sort of liberating technology or this is sort of misinformation technology. And the reason why that debate is there is because everything depends on the context. And we need to understand that very well. So there are three things which social media brings to the world with this technology, which is in some ways unprecedented. One, which we just discussed before when we discussed the algorithms, and generally the fact that algorithms determine what we see is one, and that brings us to the discussion that, exposure to social media makes you more xenophobic, more right-wing in some ways, and things like this. So that's one effect. But there are other very important effects. So there is an information effect and coordination effect. So social media also lowers the barrier to entry to become media in an unprecedented way. So any of us can become big media if we just generate really good enough content. That changes a lot of things. And second, there's a coordination effect. Why? Because when you organize protest, you can click now, I'm going in on Facebook, and that actually helps solving coordination problems. So both of these information effect, which allows opposition to reach out, like Alexei Navalny, to audience in places where traditional media is unfree, and the coordination effect. These two effects are much more important in places where the real grievances are the corrupt autocrats. So what makes social media role different in different places? It is about what the real grievances are. And of course, I would definitely say that there are very important democratizing roles of social media in places like Russia or China, for example, and that's why the autocrats understand it very well. They don't even need research. They already knew that they needed to control this, because otherwise that's a threat to them. So, and I don't think there is a necessarily internal contradiction between them. It's just a complicated, complex phenomenon which acts differently depending on the context. That's how I would summarize it. But I'm happy to talk more about it if
Thank
time
you.
permits, which I guess it would be problematic.
Australia, Indonesia, and Malaysia banned use of TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and X for children 16 and under. France and United Kingdom, as far as I understand, are considering banning social media for children. What is your take on those decisions?
So I have another line of research which looks at the mental health effect of social media. And there we find really quite devastating negative effects on mental health, particularly for children and young adults. And that leads me to believe, and also on top of that, Matt Gensko with his co-authors also have very important effect or results on the fact that it's addictive. So these combination of these things tell me that, you know, the regulation is absolutely necessary when we think about the exposure of young individuals who still cannot really decide for themselves to these platforms. It's very dangerous, and I think that's a right move. It should be done carefully. It should be done, let's say, with a lot of evidence. But I would certainly think that this is a very reasonable thing to do. Let's put it this way. So, of course, there are different issues with adults and kids, and with kids, I would definitely support it.
In March 2026, juries in New Mexico and California found Meta and Google's YouTube liable for deliberately designing platforms that harm children. Do you think it's fair? Is it possible to deliberately design platforms that harm children?
So I don't have an answer to that question. I can only tell you that there is substantial evidence by now that it does harm children. Whether that was deliberate or not, that's something which investigators should determine. On top of that, honestly, I think sort of what does deliberate mean? That's another thing where, you know, it's a legal term. So I can imagine the situation in which the only deliberate thing was, you know, the seek of profit. And then the fact that this also had some negative effects on children, you know, then you could imagine that from the point of view of this platform, that's a collateral damage. It's not deliberate. So I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I cannot comment on also on the motives, but I can comment on the effects, and the effects are sizable and measurable.
There is a whole bunch of papers now that deal with how technologies shape social cognition and knowledge production. And in several papers written by, you probably, you know, Molly Crockett in Princeton, you know, Crockett Lab, and etc., just, you know, different authors. So they write that political discussions infused with emotional language were shared, and when the more emotional is, you know, the post on X or on Facebook, the more emotional language used, the more widely it's shared across Facebook and Twitter. Is it to say that social networks benefit from distributing opinions rather than news and analysis?
That's absolutely correct. We know that, and we see that in our study. We see it across different contexts, and we know why. And we know that because of social psychology, because people react more to the content which is sort of angry and emotional compared to reacting to facts.
So if one wants to multiply, to get more likes and more followers on its, Twitter or on its X or Facebook, all this one has to do is just produce some angry content.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. One more question related to the same, this psychological effect. Brady and Crockett, they argue that social media can be viewed as an exaggerated digital version of a gossip network. They write, quote, "We are motivated to exchange information that satisfies our need to belong. This includes societal level phenomena such as political uprising and national elections." Anyway, so they argue that it's this gossiping helps people, especially those who lived in big urban dwellings, feel, like they have a community, they belong to certain community, and this gossiping effect helps people to sort of deal with, with their loneliness and such. What would you say of that?
Well, I would say the following, that what we know from pretty well identified studies, that when people sort of spend time on TikTok or on Facebook, they stop going to bars, they stop socializing with peers offline, and that actually, at the end makes them more lonely and sort of produces a lot of mental health problems, and that also makes them angry, and that actually has, at the end, also political effects. So I think, it definitely makes. Look, here I'm pretty sure that what you said is true for a subset of users. So users who are not social, who have no friends to start with, are probably benefiting from that because they actually get to have some kind of social network of people which otherwise they wouldn't have access to. But for an average user, that's not true. The average user actually loses in terms of social ties because of social media. Well, at the same time, look,
yeah.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
I just wanted to follow up on this. So look, there are, for example, very interesting phenomena which have to do with some like crazy conspiracy theories, like flat earthers, for example. I mean, there's a very big community of flat earthers, like something like 2 million people in the US only. So of course, for these people found their community online. They wouldn't have found it otherwise. They wouldn't be like people in a local bar wouldn't be talking to them about flat being earth being flat. Sorry, and for these people, that certainly is the case, that they are benefiting in their weird views from having access to this pool of the whole world, where then you can find sufficient number of people who are as crazy as you, let's say. So, maybe that's not very politically correct way to put it, but okay, hold similar views.
Any questions from the audience? Or I can continue with mine. Okay, so Katya, there are a lot of papers that say that the kind of political outcomes that we watch in the democratic countries and democracies now, they have had to do with the COVID effect. That during COVID, people were basically constrained to their houses and apartments. People, like in the United States, different prayer houses, church, synagogues, they they used to play a very important role in building associations. People were coming to on Saturday, on Sunday to their house of prayer, and they discussed after the service, they discussed different political views, etc., etc. As a result of COVID, people were staying at home, and that's what affected badly, these associations and possibility for people to exchange views with their friends and churchgoers outside internet. Do you expect that now, when more and more companies asked for people to stop working for a long distance and come to the office? I know that, for instance, American Express is building a new office on Manhattan because they want people to come to the office. The same is true for many other big companies. Don't you think that these may have an impact on the role of social media and social networks?
Honestly, I don't know. So
Okay.
I think it's hard to say. I can speculate, but I don't have any grounds to tell you
So
what.
you don't think that that COVID had a pronounced
COVID definitely had a huge effect on that, but it moved equilibrium. Whether that equilibrium could be sort of focused back to the previous equilibrium, I don't know. And
okay.
it's hard to say, and I think it will depend on the corporate culture and stuff like this. I think in the UK there is no question that nobody is coming back to the offices, but in the US it's possible. And how it's going to affect the social media use, I don't know. I think there is a much more important question about the changing of the equilibrium. It's not about people coming back to the office. It's about AI. So it is. I expect that a lot of social media will be pushed out by people chatting with chatbots rather than any big effect of or sort of whether you are in the office or not.
Thank you.
And that's a whole different important issue.
Yes. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes, please.
Very simple one. What about YouTube? Why we didn't even mention that huge source of information?
Absolutely.
Is
So
there
there's
any research? Or
yeah, there's some research. There's some research on YouTube algorithm. I haven't been doing it, but I'm aware of these papers. Look, yeah, the only thing you can do to really try to measure its effect separately is to have a deactivation study, and I am not aware of that kind of thing. The algorithm certainly works in an interesting way on YouTube, and it's worth studying it. Look, I mean, there are many other things which we haven't mentioned also, but we needed to focus on something. But yeah, all of this is interesting. And like in some ways, when we talk about the general effects of like mobile broadband, I would definitely suspect that exposure to YouTube is a very important part of that story.